Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. I'm excited for this video because it's the last video in my series of, let's call them initial overviews or elaborations of the steps in my process of slowly getting to know a poem. I have up here the video description for my welcome video where I lay out and name those steps. I think in some of my videos I've been mixing up the verbs for these steps and sometimes forgetting which nouns are plural and which ones aren't. But I thought I might review them here for you. Step 1, reading aloud. Step 2, bean counting. Step 3, listening for sound and sense. Step 4, describing form and figures. Step 5, shaping ideas and questions. And today we'll be looking at sketching possible contexts. And I'll conclude with just a few seconds on the importance of sometime down the road looking again at the poem. So sketching possible contexts, I think in my previous video on ideas and questions, I accidentally used the verb sketch here, but there I think I like the idea of shaping ideas and questions a little better. And sketching, which is a much more of a kind of provisional exploratory activity, I think makes much more sense when thinking about contexts. So this grid I developed pretty recently to help my students think about their own interests and their own concerns when designing research projects for my classes. But I've taken to really thinking of it as a useful heuristic or a useful tool for generating ideas of where I might want to take projects of my own. And it's useful because it helps me orient research projects according to what I still need to know, or where I think my interests can make the most good or the best interventions in existing conversations or scholarship. So whenever I am looking at a primary text or a work, for instance, Sylvia Plath's Morning Song, I might ask myself a series of questions that pertain to each of these four quadrants. And once I have answers to those questions, I can use those answers to help coordinate a research agenda where I go out and learn a lot more than I already know, and then come back to the poem, come back to the primary text with that sort of enriched sense of a context in which now to understand it, in which now to kind of think about the notes I've already taken. And so you can already see in my description of this that looking back at the poem is actually kind of part of the future of step 6 here of looking at possible contexts. It is step 6, right? Yes, possible contexts. That's another thing I kept messing up and naming the videos and talking about the videos is what number step are we on? So this is 6. So what are the possible contexts? There are any number of contexts. And so the framework I've developed here is a little arbitrary and a little artificial, but I think it's been very helpful, at least for me and for a few of my students, to think about how their own research interests should be motivated not so much by outside forces, but by their own sense of interest and their own sense of what they themselves can contribute to the world and to ongoing conversations. So the first question I pose to students and I pose to myself is something like, who do you want to talk about this text with? Who's the audience for your close reading or your interpretation or where you might want to take the project you're working on? This doesn't mean I have to then go and write the paper. Remember, for a lot of the poems I get to know, I really have no plans to write an essay or write a piece of scholarship. But I think in slowly getting to know a poem, part of that knowledge process is also keeping track of what I don't know yet and what I may want to know should I take that extra step, right? So one thing when it comes to thinking about who I want to talk to, I may consider ongoing or desired conversations about the primary text or author. And this might mean thinking about the reception history of that text or of the author, book reviews. If a book was published in the early 20th century, did someone write about it? In the case of Morning Song, which was published in the collection Ariel after Plath's death, what were the book reviews for that poetry collection? Do they mention this poem? Right. So these might be things I would want to go find out and think about. But of course, I might also be interested in scholarship, or in any personal reactions I might come across, including my own. In other words, how might I situate my own responses to the text within a big network of other responses to Plath or to the poet or to the particular text I'm thinking about? I have Plath in mind because that's the example. She's the example, and Morning Song's the example I'm going to look at when I'm done going over this. Uh, in terms of self or culture, I not all students have questions that might pertain to questions of self or culture, but I do think it's worthwhile reminding students that they live in a culture, and that they might have a sense of self that might matter to how they've been responding to a poem. So this is where you might consider categories of or concerns pertaining to identity, social groups, cultures, or subcultures. And so this is when we might ask questions about sex or gender or race, um, nationality, these sorts of categories, and how they might become an important frame and context for thinking about a poem. In terms of theory and concepts, I do find that a lot of university courses on literary criticism maybe overemphasize and spend too much time here, introducing students to terms that could orient a reading of a primary text, and not spending really enough time on some of these other concerns. Although, of course, some of those theories and contexts do ask questions about what a reader is, and also theorize some of these um, concepts in the top right of your screen. But the terms that literary studies as a discipline is interested in originate in literary studies, but they also are drawn from or originate in other disciplines, particularly disciplines like psychoanalysis, sociology, philosophy, economics. And so when I talk about theories or concepts that might orient my understanding of a primary text or a poem, that could be something as simple as metaphor. What is a metaphor? What does that term mean? What's the development of that term? How have literary theorists of lyric, explored and opened up our understanding of how metaphor and metaphoricity works? But I might also ask questions about ideology, or the famous Freud idea of the Oedipus complex, whether or not we take it seriously. There was a time in history where it was taken very seriously, and many people still take it very seriously. So maybe that might be something I'd be drawn to. Or surplus value, fungibility. These are all, I'm not going to define these are just examples of sort of heavy concepts that may, depending on your own interests and the kind of reading you do outside of literary studies, in and outside of it, that might sort of shape and affect and inflect your thinking about a text. And then lastly, the bottom right quadrant is sometimes what literary scholars generally mean by context. So when we think about, um, when teachers or scholars insist that you situate your reading in a context, sometimes this is all they mean. But really, all of these, to my mind, are contexts. The bottom right hand corner pertains to what I just call the world, a sort of general sense of matters regarding the real material world outside of the text. So, examples of this might include the author's life, meaning biography or autobiography, history and history of all kinds, literary history, but also national history, cultural history, histories of institutions. This might also involve scholars going to an archive in a library somewhere and looking at archival documents, or maybe thinking about the role of institutions like history, like museums, libraries, hospitals, prisons, in the shaping of a particular text, or the shaping of the context in which a text was produced. I share all this not to say that one has to take notes on all of these kinds of contexts, but rather these are, to me, the possible domains someone can sort of draw from in order to map out for themselves what they might want to know before, either before pursuing a more professional uh, assessment, interpretation, evaluation of a text, or just in some sense a self-evaluation of what they themselves still might want to know uh, before doing anything like that. And sometimes it's a good self-reflection that keeps one humble, even if one has spent hours taking notes about a poem. Spending some time asking what sort of contexts I might need to investigate in order to, maybe someday pursue a more professional account of the poem sort of keeps me humble and reminds me that I clearly don't know everything, although that's been pretty evident, I think, already in some of these videos. Right, so those are the contexts. What does this look like then when what does it look like then when I sit with a poem and take some notes about contexts that might shape uh, future study? In the case of Morning Song, um, the notes are pretty simple. Some possible contexts might be variants of the poem, meaning other versions of the poem that either exist in Plath's archive or in other published editions. I might be particularly interested in any editorial notes that accompany those variants, especially in the new edition of Plath's poem that was published just earlier this year, 2026, if you're watching this in a year following 2026. I might also be interested in scholarship on mid century American and British poems about parenthood, motherhood, infants, children, generational relation or relationship. Scholarship on Morning Song, particularly. It's a well known Plath poem, widely celebrated, or maybe just Ariel in general, since it is the poem that leads off that collection, both in Ted Hughes's more well-known sort of arrangement of those late poems, but also in Plath's typescript. I think Morning Song is the leading poem. Also, feminist theory, scholarship on pregnancy, early motherhood, midwifery. It occurred to me that in some of my earlier notes about figures, that I had assumed that the museum here could be a figure or a metaphor for the hospital, but of course, the presence of the word midwife, which I just kind of leapt over, reminded me that the setting here, especially at the beginning of the poem, might not be a hospital at all. And so that it occurred to me that I probably need to do quite a bit more reading about pregnancy, childbirth in mid-century United States, Britain, and also feminist scholars who theorize some of the culture and institutions and policies and experiences of women or pregnant people who moved through those spaces or experiences. Of course, looking at Heather Clark's masterful biography, which I just pulled off the shelf behind me, it's enormous. Using its amazing index to track some of these concerns as she explores them in her account of Plath's life. And then more generally, in terms of literary theory, thinking a bit about apostrophe, um, figuration, infants as the that's meant to be addressees of a poem. It does seem to me that might be also particularly useful. I mean, having an infant as an addressee of a sort of lyric speaker is a particularly interesting arrangement because it's an auditor or an addressee who is shown to be responsive in the poem, but is not responsive hmm, to what the poet or what the speaker is saying, or to the sort of signification of the words and phrases in the poem. So the poet is in some sense engaged in a kind of apostrophe, although in a different way than say addressing a muse or something like that. So I want to think I would want to think a bit about some of that, going, for instance, to Jonathan Culler as a first stop, maybe, to think about some of these terms. All right, so I think that's all I'm going to sort of talk about for today with respect to sketching possible contexts. I do hope me explaining this quadrant system is of potential interest to some viewers of this channel. I do think it's very useful as a kind of self-evaluation. Uh, it also is useful as an exercise in mapping one's own interests and mapping what one's interests and one's approach to those interests could contribute to ongoing conversations and scholarship. In the case of Donna Kelly's Brood, I won't type these things out. I would definitely want to track Kelly's use of, say, insect imagery, natural imagery, especially in her most recent poetry collection. Given my initial sense of the use of the word nymph as a mythological reference, that later revised itself when I realized the cicada imagery of the poem into a different sort of denotation. I am still kind of curious to what degree that mythological layer is still operative in the poem and if it's operative elsewhere in the collection, especially given the collection's interest in well, in love, which I won't go into because I'm only talking about this poem. So that might be one thing I'm particularly interested in terms of a context. The other poems in the collection that Kelly published almost a decade after the initial publication of this poem in Sewanee Review. Um, in the case of In Memoriam and Shakespeare's Sonnet 9, the possible contexts there would also include the other sections or other sonnets that surround these specific poems, in addition to thinking about what other scholars have thought about some of the ideas and questions I raise with respect to them. I'm especially curious if Shakespeareans have written about the use of bad arguments in the sonnets, or if there is a general sense that the quality of a sonnet sort of hangs on the quality of its argument. I'm kind of curious about if that discourse is out there. Again, I probably won't write about it, but I may take a few minutes or maybe an hour or two and sort of poke around, or maybe I might pick the brain of some Shakespeareans I know about that very issue. I'm much more likely to write about Alfred Lord Tennyson in the future, who's a little closer to my area of specialization in early 20th century literature. He's still, I mean, in memoriam, still 1850s, so still several decades away from what I tend to write about. But Tennyson is so important to a lot of the figures I work on in my own scholarship. Um, but here I'm especially curious about Tennis Stevens, Wallace Stevens. That's a slip of the tongue. Another poet that I have written about Tennyson's use of questions in memoriam, and how the questions work rhetorically, but also how they work as kind of mood setters or mood rearrangers. And then also when his speaker uses quotation or imagines or personifies another figure or imagines another person saying something. Um, because the poems initially seem quite simple in their staging, but it does seem to me the use of questions, the use of quotation complicates the kind of grid of sorrow and the experiments in mourning and elegy that In Memoriam is developing. So, so I think that's it. Almost 20 minutes. I had intended this to be a little bit of a shorter video. Um, I won't do a video on the very separately on the very last step of looking back at a poem. I hope I hope that step is self-explanatory. And in some sense, depending on one's relationship to particular poems, might be something you continually do over a lifetime. I know In Memoriam, Morning Song, These are poems I keep coming back to over and over and over again. Whereas Brood is pretty new to me, and maybe I'll keep coming back to Donica Kelly and her work. The sonnets, of course, partly because of Shakespeare's reputation, are poems I come back to pretty regularly. But Sonnet 9 is not necessarily a well-known one, and to be honest, I'm not sure I will go back to it. We'll see. We'll see. I'm not sure. All right. Well, I hope these sort of dedicated overviews of each step in my process of slowly getting to know a poem have been of interest or useful to you. And I look forward to thinking about where this channel might go and the future videos that I'll record and continue to share with you. All right. Well, I hope you read some poems today, and let's read more tomorrow.